tonight to workshop number 2, Migrant Children, focused on the topic of child labor, prostitution, and trafficking. My name is Pierrette Hondenu Sotelo. I'm not Jennifer Chacon, who was going to be moderating, but I was sort of pulled in here at the last minute and happy to be of service and was already eager to listen to these panelists. Let me just tell you the lineup. We will hear from each of the panelists in the order in which they appear on the program. Then we'll have a few minutes for discussion among our panelists, if they care to pose questions to one another. And then we'll open it up for about a half an hour of Q&A and engagement with everybody. We'll begin with Leyla Strotkamp, who is visiting us from Washington. She works with the U.S. Department of Labor and the Bureau of International Labor Affairs. And she'll have approximately 10 to 12 minutes for presentations. And if people go over, cut it up. Thank you.
Thank you for having me today on this panel. I'm pleased to speak with you and tell you more about the work that my office does. So this will be an overview of the Department of Labor's approach to fighting child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking internationally. So I'll just briefly tell you about who we are, what we do, what guides our work, and a few of our key accomplishments and objectives. So the office was created back in 1993 in response to congressional interest in the subject of child labor as it was gaining prominence on the international scene and in the context of the development of the ILO's Convention 182 on the worst forms of child labor. The office began as primarily a research-oriented office, and a couple of years later we began receiving appropriations from Congress to award grants to NGOs and other civil society actors to carry out programming in foreign countries at the very local level to combat the worst forms of child labor. So overall, we have two main areas of work. One is research and reporting, which stems from laws that have been passed that require us to issue annual reports, as well as some presidential directives in the form of executive orders. We also fund research by other organizations to try to expand the knowledge base generally on these topics. And then in the area of the grant making, our objectives are to fund direct action to prevent and withdraw children from the worst forms of child labor, or to build capacity, and we do that in large part through a partnership with the International Labor Organization's Program for the Elimination of Child Labor to work directly with governments to build their capacity to combat these problems. So in terms of what guides our work, our policy framework is focused on the international standards that come from the International Labor Organization. And the key ones are Convention 138 on the minimum age to work, Convention 182, as I mentioned before, on the worst forms of child labor. And then there are two relevant conventions on forced labor. One is Convention 29, which was discussed this morning in the plenary, which defines forced labor, and Convention 105, which specifies for member states specifically what is outlawed practices that would constitute forced labor. So, and in addition, we also look at the Palermo Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking of persons. So in a nutshell, the standard framework that we use is through the lens of primarily Convention 182 on the worst forms of child labor. We see child trafficking and forced child labor, and also migrant child labor generally, as part of a larger context of different forms of exploitation of children. And we also see it within a spectrum of acceptable forms of child work on one end, all the way to these worst forms that should be prohibited in any circumstances. And just to quickly go over what the worst forms of child labor are, first, any type of forced labor, trafficking, forced child soldiering, or slavery or practices similar to it. Any type of child sexual exploitation, such as prostitution or pornography. Third, illicit activities, the use of a child in illicit activities, particularly in drug trafficking or production. And then the fourth category is a bit more ambiguous and is left to member states to define what it means, and that is hazardous work, which is broadly considered to be detrimental to the health, safety, or morals of children. In terms of the reporting that we do, as I said, we have mandates from Congress and from the President, and so we publish annually a set of 3 reports. The first one I'm going to talk about was the first one that was issued. It was signed by President Clinton in 1999, and it is called the Prohibition of Acquisition of Products Produced by Forced or Indentured Child Labor. And it requires that our office develop a list of products that we have reason to believe were produced, mined, or manufactured using forced child labor. This legislation has the objective of preventing the U.S. government from buying goods that were made in this way. So the first step is that the list is created, which is what our office does, and then any contractor, any agency that wants to contract for goods of any type needs to check that list, which is by country and the specific product. And if the contractor is going to provide that good, they need to make an attestation, or they need to certify in their contract that they are not going to provide products that were produced in that manner. The second one I'm going to talk about is the Trade and Development Act, which was issued in the reauthorization in 2000, included a requirement for the Department of Labor to produce country profiles on findings on the worst forms of child labor in countries that receive benefits through trade preference programs. So these are primarily developing countries that the U.S. government is offering certain trade benefits to, and as part of the requirements for remaining eligible for those benefits, they have to be maintaining progress toward eliminating the worst forms of child labor. So currently we report on about 144 countries and territories. I said there's a country-specific profile that looks at, first of all, what's the nature of the problem, if there is one. And then the rest of the report is about what are the different facets of the government's response to it. So looking at their laws and regulations, mechanisms for intergovernmental coordination and enforcement, what policies do they have in place, and then what social programs to address child labor. The final legislative mandate I want to talk about is the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2005. So this is the comprehensive anti-trafficking law that the government first passed in 2000. And in 2005, they added a requirement for the Department of Labor to produce a second list of goods. So rather than the first one I told you about is for this case of forced child labor, the second list is for 2 categories. One is forced labor in the production of goods, and the other one is child labor. So more expansive in terms of now we are asked to collect and analyze information on the forced labor of adults, not only children. And then on the child labor side, not only compulsory labor is covered, but these other forms that I've just told you about. I will mention briefly, we were not the lead agency on this mandate, but we were named to the consultative group to eliminate the use of child labor and forced labor in imported agricultural products. So this was a convening that was housed in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it involved also the Department of State, the Department of Labor, and representatives from business and civil society to come together to look at what sort of elements need to be in place for a certification process that U.S. importers could use to assure that they're not bringing in or selling child labor or forced labor tainted goods. So we're a member of that consultative group, which then has issued guidelines, and the next step is to pilot those guidelines through a project which we are currently working on funding. So I guess I would just say overall, in terms of our mandates, our reporting, is that our approach is that we take this research that we do and turn it into action, so that we hope that our research will not only inform the general public, but it will complement our own priorities for the assistance that we provide in different countries to combat worst forms of child labor. Finally, I just want to mention some of the key accomplishments of our office over the years. Since 1995, we funded over 250 projects to combat child labor in over 90 countries and worked with more than 60 organizations. And as a result of these efforts, approximately 1.5 million children have been rescued from child labor. Secondly, as I mentioned before, we fund projects that build capacity at the state level, but also at the local level in individual communities and villages, including training labor inspectors and law enforcement officials. And finally, we feel proud that we've been able to contribute to the knowledge base on child labor and forced labor through over 35 official publications and funding research through academic and independent research organizations. So we seek to partner and dialogue with other stakeholders with this information that we've collected, especially governments, but increasingly businesses. And that our solutions are going to be conceived in this larger economic and social developmental context. So we're bringing to bear not only sort of these very specific findings on is there a problem in a particular sector, but what do you need to do to get to the root causes of child labor and forced labor, and to see that in the context of families, supporting families so that child labor is less needed to have their stability as a family, and that communities can understand the context of the problem.
Great, very good, thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Professor Emir Estrada, who is an adjunct professor in the Department of Sociology and a recent PhD from the USC Department of Sociology, and she'll be speaking about child labor in Los Angeles.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? Yes? Okay, great. Well, it's really an honor to be part of this panel, and in this presentation I focus on the experiences of Latino boys and girls ages 10 and 18 who work with their parents as street vendors in Boyle Heights. And Boyle Heights, for those of you that are from California, is a small neighborhood in Los Angeles that where the Latino population make up 94% of this community. And I would like to start by introducing you to one of my respondents. I call her Josefina. I met 16-year-old Josefina while she was selling hot dogs and Gatorades with her mother at a park near her house during the soccer season. I bought and ate a hot dog and informally chatted with her about soccer, school, my family, their business, and my study, or as the homework assignment, as I used to call it when I would meet with them. After convincing them that I was not a social worker, an undercover police, a health inspector, or a street vendor trying to learn about their business and steal their street vending spot, they agreed to an interview with me the next day at their home. Later they told me that they only agreed to the interview because a health inspector or a police officer would not have eaten their food. I arrived early the next day and waited on the porch in their modest one-bedroom apartment while Josefina walked home from school. Once Josefina arrived, her mother and stepfather left her in charge with their 3 siblings, ages 12, 5, and 4, while they went to street vend. During my interview with Josefina, she expressed enthusiasm for her upcoming high school graduation. She told me that she almost had the $486 she needed for her graduation packet that included her senior regalia and for her cap and gown and her senior field trip. Those of you that graduate from the US, you know that's really important to have your senior field trip. She added that every time she and her mother go street vending, she puts money aside to buy merchandise, for food and rent for the house. And for the last few months, she's been allocating part of that earnings for her graduation expenses. At this very young age, she is already in charge of her mother's finances and assumes adult-like responsibilities that are not typical for children her age. Now, like Josefina, all of the children and youth in my study juggle family, street vending, and school responsibilities. Now, most street vendors in the US are undocumented, and resort to this type of occupation because they lack opportunities in the formal sector of the economy due to the lack of documented status and English language skills. My respondents, however, like Josefina, are not immigrants, but they are children of immigrants born in the US, as they're known as the 1.5 or second generation. This means that they were born in the US or came to the US before the age of 13. This study is based on 66 interviews with children like Josefina and their parents. I also spent 3 years in the field conducting ethnographic data. Basically what that means is I ate a lot of food, I spent a lot of time with them, I street vended with them, I conducted home visits, and I also went to various social events, including parties, which I enjoyed a lot, church visits, and I had the unfortunate event to go to one of the funerals as well of one of my respondents. In the remaining of this presentation, I focus on how gender shapes children's work experience in street vending. And these are part of the findings that Garrett and I co-authored a paper in an edited volume. So I'm borrowing from that article. Now, when I started my research, I was surprised to find that more girls street vended than boys. The street or the public sphere is seen as an inappropriate place and dangerous place for girls. Sociologist Robert Smith, for example, reminds us that immigrant parents in particular are very protective of their daughters, and as a result, they are often confined to the private sphere, the home, or the school. Now, 32 of my respondents were girls, and 11 of them were boys. My goal was to have an even distribution in my sample, but my time in the field revealed that it was more girls that were street vending than boys. Girls also had more household responsibilities in addition to cooking, sweeping, vacuuming, helping with the laundry, and caring for younger siblings, as we see in the opening vignette with Josefina. Girls were also seen as more apt for street vending responsibilities than the boys that I studied, and also that their brothers. Now, according to my interviews and observations, girls sell more than boys because they are perceived as cleaner and that their male counterparts, and they're also less threatening and more approachable than men. For example, Katia said, "Some people think, oh, she's more clean," and I'm quoting, "because she's a girl, and when they see a guy, they think, oh no." They do that a lot, like people don't think about it, but they do see it. Oh, she's a girl, she's clean to handle the food, such as the hot dogs, pupusas, tamales. I'm making you guys hungry? What did you just say? Katia's brother did not help street vend. Unlike Katia, he had the liberty to spend time with his friends, the girlfriend, and because Katia was a girl, he had to be with her mother for protection. This ultimately meant that she had to spend more time with her mother and thus working longer hours. Like Katia, many of the girls I interviewed complained about the work, especially when their brothers did not have to work or refused to work. The majority of them, however, rationalized why it made more economic sense for them to street vend over their brothers. Now, in terms of financial contributions, the family developed various work strategies. Some worked together on one stand. Other families sent individual members to man their own street vending stands. This meant that each member pooled a separate income from their sales. For example, the Garcia family, consisting of 5 members, the mother, the father, and 3 siblings, they sold huaraches. Does anybody know what huaraches is? They're not sandos, it's food. So it's an oval-shaped, freshly made tortilla topped with meat and vegetables and salsa, very delicious. And they sold on Saturdays from 6 in the morning to 1:30 p.m. So the family had a total of 3 stands. The first stand was the main one where they made the huaraches, and the 2 other ones was juice stands. And the first one was manned by the mom, the dad, and the oldest daughter. And in here they generated about $800 to $1,000 per day, at 6 in the morning to 1:30. The 18-year-old brother who was selling juice would make about $150 to $200. And the youngest sister, age 12, who also sold juice at a different corner, made about $80 to $100 every time. So the total contribution from children here was about $320 on good days. And the income for the family on that day was about $1,320. And this was a family that was doing relatively well. It wasn't, not all the members in my sample would have an income like this. Now this was a popular strategy among the street vending families, but this strategy was not something that always came from the parents. Children were very aware of the household needs and business income. They developed high level of maturity at a very young age, and they took it upon themselves to find ways to maximize their earnings. Children made decisions regarding the business and also influenced the way business functioned. When I interviewed the oldest sister, the one that sold with the parents, she told me that a lady used to help them, but she recently stopped coming. So instead of hiring somebody else, she suggested to her dad that instead of replacing her with another member, they should have their youngest sister help out. Up until this point, the youngest sister, age 12, was not helping. She would just spend time shopping or in the car or playing with friends. So the children in the Garcia family did not get paid for their work. This might raise some eyebrows, especially given the context of the conference. Now this was a similar pattern among the rest of my respondents. Only a handful of the children received money for their work. Those that did get money for their work received $5 to $20 every time they'd helped street vend. The Garcia kids, however, as the majority of my respondents, said that they got anything they wanted. Okay, what does this mean? One girl said, if I really want something, she said, and I ask for it, I can get it. Another girl said that usually when she worked, and if, for example, they went to the mall the next day, she felt that she could ask for whatever she wanted. On the other hand, if she was lazy, in her own words, if I was lazy and didn't help my parents, I knew that if we went out, I couldn't ask for any material goods. Now, gender certainly shaped the experience of these adolescent street vendors. Girls often ended up working more than their parents because they were not given the freedom to stay home or visit with their friends or with their boyfriends, like in the case of their brothers. Yet street vending also offered them several benefits, including respect and recognition from their parents. As described earlier, many said they gained purchasing power or the decision or the right to ask for material goods, and that including a shirt, shoes, pants, little things that they wanted from the mall, for example. Special mobility was another benefit, and they were able to invest in their own education. Take the words of Monica, for example. She highlights the benefits of her newly acquired spatial mobility, or her ability to now being able to socialize and go out with her friends. During my interview, she told me, when I asked her why she was helping her parents, she said, you are doing it because you have to help your parents out. But it's fun at the same time because you have fun seeing different people every day. So she expressed how it's fun for her to see different people. Every Friday, there's something different going on. Before we sold tacos, I was at home Fridays and it would be boring, she said. Like just watching TV and going to the computer and doing the same thing. So for Monica, I gave her the opportunity to meet with her cousins, flirt with guys as well, and with customers, and just get out of the house and not have a boring routine. So going out and socializing was just another benefit reported by the girls that I interviewed. Education was another area of investment. Claudia told me, she said that her dad said, you don't have to help anymore because she's getting ready to transfer to the local Cal State University. And she said, no, I want to help you because that means I'm going to have more expenses. So I'll help you one day, and then I can pay for my Cal State tuition. So in conclusion, the topic of children and work is very controversial, and it has been since the turn of the 20th century. Historians and sociologists noted the shift that occurred in the 20th century, where children went from being economically useful and valued for their labor contributions to being emotionally priceless and in need of protection. Now, this shift took place in the context of industrialization, modernity, compulsory education laws that saw school and the private sphere as the proper place for children and not work or the public sphere, the street, and specifically in the case of my study. It is not normative for children to work with their and if they do so, it's for their own pocket money. They want to invest in for themselves, so they want to buy their own stuff, but not for the family's survival. Now, this does not mean that children have not continued to work. As we have seen from this study, some children disadvantaged by race, class, and their parents' immigration status have played a key role in the family economy. Now, I would like to clarify, especially again, I'd like to clarify that I'm not advocating for child labor, nor do I make valid judgments of whether this type of family pooled income strategy is good or bad. This is not a recommendation that children ought to be street vendors. Rather, I have found a world to explore that tells bigger questions about Latino families in the U.S. And in some level, street vending limits the girls in this study. This in turn broadens our understanding of domesticity and gender oppression beyond the limits of the home and the private sphere. My study shows that within these limitations, the girls are capable of challenging gender norms, and in turn, they might benefit from the study. So I look forward to your questions, comments, and easy critiques. And thank you for your time, and welcome to the conference.
All right, thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Anthony Marcus. He's an anthropologist educated at NYU, and he's now at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and he's done research on children, teens, sex work in the U.S., and various other continents.
Okay, I'm afraid can people hear me back there? Okay, I'm afraid I'm gonna have to bring us back to what the people in the morning said we shouldn't focus on so much, which is sex and sex trafficking. But I'm gonna focus in particular on the TVPA defined child sex trafficking, which basically involves any commercial sex act done by a minor before midnight on the 18th birthday, which constitutes severe trafficking, correct? Regardless of whether there's a trafficker or not. And this is in somewhat contrary to most age of consent laws, which about 16 depending on the act and the people involved, and most right to work laws, which can be anywhere from 13 to 15. So, I say that because it's essentially come to be known as either child sex trafficking or the commercial sexual exploitation of children. And a lot of the respondents that I met on fieldwork find it peculiar to be designated as children if they're 17-year-old and have been living on their own, and sometimes even have 1 or 2 kids on their own that they're actually supporting through sex work. So, I'll be drawing on 3 studies, all unusual in that they're data taken in situ. Most of the studies of trafficking involve data taken ex situ once the person being studied is removed from research and the environment being researched. Literally, narratives are taken in police stations. Often Christian diversion programs seem to be a lot of the academic narratives, where one of the conditions for not being imprisoned is being in this rescue institution. And so often people are asked questions about whether what they've been doing has led to crisis. You get a bunch of people in crisis and ask them if what they're doing leads to crisis. A bit tautological. So these are in situ, which is a new area, and so there's a lot of kinks in the research that I'm hoping some people will ask me about, and I'll try to answer, but probably not perfectly successful. Okay, the first study was a study done in New York City that interviewed an N of 249. It interviewed about 350 only minors involved in sex work. And it used respondent-driven sampling. That's a kind of peer referral system that breaks homophily by going beyond people's own social networks and enables what amounts to something like a random sample with very high probability intervals. And that was an attempt to actually count the number of, to do a real count of the number of C-sec victims in New York City, and it came out with an estimate through social network analysis, and also through capture recapture, which is what is traditionally used for counting fish in a pond, where you have some kind of external referent and then you make a population count. And also a lot of data, ethnographic data came out of it. The second study conducted in situ was in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and it involved an RDS also, but more importantly, intensive ethnographic research in the small. It's all on an island. It's a small city actually with a relatively large sex market, but it's all very contained. And it involved about 20 to 25 researchers plus about 15 key informants who were involved, and about roughly a year of intensive, basically getting to know everybody there who was selling sex and everybody under 18 who was selling sex. So in some ways, I think we could say we achieved an ethnographic complete census, even if there's not the mathematical basis for claiming some kind of a representative or random sample. And the third study makes no claim to representation or sampling things. It's a snowball non-probability sample of 85 pimps in New York City. And we did this to actually find out what the reality of pimps are, because it hasn't actually been seriously studied in the United States since the 1970s when Milner and Melvin did it. And this is the basis of a PhD for a woman named Amber Horning, who look for her books in the future. I think they're going to be very exciting. So I'm drawing on those three data sets. Now, the primary findings we came out with for this are that pimps in general, who are sort of the basis of a lot of your TVPA socio-legal institutions, are not actually very much involved with minors who are selling sex. We found that using mostly the New York study, because it's the best statistics, that somewhere between 10% and at most 15%, using a pretty broad definition of pimp, actually had a pimp, reported having a pimp. This is very much in contradistinction to the numbers that come out of TVPA prosecutions, where 40% of all the trafficking prosecutions roughly are for child sex trafficking, and probably somewhere, I forget the number actually, but it's somewhere between 60 and 80%, it's in my notes, of the convictions are at this point are African American men in the pimp role. So we're seeing a sort of disturbing pattern here, but we actually found that there were not that many minors who were selling sex. The ones who were not involved with pimps, and that the girls who were being saved by this, about 40 to 50% of those girls turned out to be boys actually, who were not covered, virtually not covered at all under the socio-legal institutions that have grown up around TVPA. In fact, to a certain degree they're excluded, and if any policies come out of this, it'd be actually worth thinking about what kind of special needs boys might have, because they always get lost in these, what is it, girls are not for sale, girls' education and mentoring services, girls, 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 right? But so those are basically the findings, and to us, in some ways, the most interesting finding at this point in our thinking about it is the fact that virtually none of the pimps that we've encountered in the three studies were particularly interested in minors who sell sex, and the minors who sell sex were not that connected to pimps. And if there was a comparative advantage that could be claimed for underage prostitution, you would expect to find a great deal more pimp interest in underage prostitutes. You'd expect to find a great deal more minors who were selling sex to have pimps, et cetera, and the underlying assumption of all of this child sex trafficking legislation is that forced or coerced labor provides a comparative advantage because you have to pay the people less, basically. And that their young, vulnerable status allows greater control. Now, virtually every labor study that's been done over the last 150 years has actually suggested that in forced or coerced labor is only more profitable under very, very specific and unusual circumstances, and that it's almost always the case that it's extremely unskilled labor that provides advantage. Now, prostitution is one of the service sector, personal service jobs where skill, presentation, things like that are almost everything involved in profitability. like hairdressing or counseling or psychotherapy or massage or those things. It matters where you're doing it, who you are, how you can talk, things like that. It's actually one of those quite intimate services that involves tremendous amounts of skill, the ability to market a product, the ability to assess the client, the ability to play to his or her fantasies, the ability to keep the situation safe. Just as an example of that, in our fieldwork in Atlantic City, where we got to know people very well, and most of them were not using pimps actually, they were using this category called spot pimps. They were basically drug dealers who hung out on the streets and made extra money, directing you, so you want to buy some drugs? No, I'm looking for a girl, okay, and then they point the person towards that person, and these spot pimps would get a $10 or $15 tip. And they do other kind of pimping services for that tip. But the spot pimps had no exclusive relationship with anybody, and they'd compete viciously with each other for who could sort of get the tip. And they used to sit and talk about which girls wouldn't pay the tip. They'd climb out the bedroom window, and quite powerless. It's casualized temporary labor, basically. It's the casualization of the sex labor workforce. So one of these women who was the most popular sex worker in the whole scene for people who wanted young girls, you know, like the sort of creepy, perverted young girl fetish thing. She was actually 20 or 21 and had 2 children. And she was by far in the most demand and could charge the most money for playing the young girl. The ones who were actually 16 and 17 actually, it turned out, didn't really have the skill to be 16-year-old girls. They were too busy trying to be tough, being defensive. They were not 16-year-old girls the way we imagine 16-year-old girls. They were tough adults on the street who were trying to protect themselves all the time, and none of these people were really interested in paying much money for them. So we're actually wondering if child sex trafficking in the United States, at least, is even profitable. Like most of these labor areas that, you know, a well-fed, high-skilled, and motivated workforce, especially when you're looking to not produce 10,000 widgets for Walmart in an hour, but when you're hoping to gain clients, is clearly the thing. And the pimps, generally, as far as we could tell, avoided minors. You always heard one story of everybody had a story, maybe even an urban legend or maybe real, but everybody had a story of some 17-year-old who could do it like a 22-year-old, who had the performativity, who had the whole thing down, and she was gifted and valued by a pimp. But for the most part, we saw almost no contact between actual serious pimp entrepreneurs who were trying to support themselves or build a business and these teenagers. To the degree, actually, where quite a few of the young women that we met expressed the sentiment that they'd seen so little of these pimps. They expressed the sentiment that real pimps didn't exist. They said, there's all those spot pimps out there, and they're always trying to claim your money, but, you know, and you'd say, well, what about the real pimps? And they'd say, you know, that's a Hollywood thing. They say, I used to watch SVU when I was a kid on the TV, and I saw all these pimps, you know, but those pimps don't exist. I would have seen them, and they were basically weighing their own experience against all of these TV stereotypes they'd seen. Now, the actual fact is these were young girls, 16, 17, 18, out on the street, who couldn't command large incomes because they didn't have a lot of performativity, and so pimps ignored them. But those real pimps that you see on TV, they actually do exist in small numbers. And they were usually working with much higher priced labor that could command hundreds, if not thousands of dollars for a sex act, and they had no interest in putting their efforts into unreliable, often drug-using people who were kind of underpaid and not that into what they were doing. They had no reason to be into it. They were doing it on the street. So the question is, there are actually, a question that's come up a lot when I've thought about this and discussed this is, who actually does profit from selling girls, you know? And across all 3 studies, we found that by far the vast majority of people trying to, especially men who are pimps, trying to make a profit off of very young girls were in loco parentis. Almost without exception, the main thing was supplementing an income, not supporting it, but defraying costs. So for instance, quite a few situations where a foster father was basically, and these are the ones where it starts very young, much younger. We found an average age of almost 16. These are the ones where it starts at 12 or 13. Unlike the typical pattern where the girl figures out it's a pimp and he doesn't care about her, she breaks away. They couldn't break away because of all the socio-legal support around the family and things like that. And quite a bit of brutality often, a lot of family domestic abuse connected to it, and often a lot of sort of disassociation where there's sort of a sense like, I need to be contributing to the family actually. So he says I have to I have to have sex with strangers, and I do it, right? Okay, the other big thing, and one of the largest categories we encountered in the New York pimp study was high school students pimping high school students to high school students. So one of the most common patterns, because the youth market seems to be so underpaid, is that the only, again, you're talking about someone who's not trying to accumulate or earn a primary income, but these are people living at home who are trying to supplement their allowance or whatever it is with sex work. So we came across quite a bit of sort of, you know, somewhat exploitive situations where high school boys were pimping friends in their social network to other friends and making arrangements and so on. But again, the power of age doesn't seem to have quite the same weight in terms of vulnerability. We came across one particularly strange case that points to some of the contradictions of your whole TVPA policy, which is a guy I'll call Reno, who was about 16 years old, late 16-year-old, when he met these two women in his high school who were both one was 17 and the other was 18, and he wound up becoming their pimp. Now, under New York state law, he would be tried as an adult for severe trafficking and probably do a 30-year sentence or something. These two were his child victims. So, what we're finding is a lot of problems in the basic assumption that drives this estimation. You know, a few cases trickle in, everybody said, and it may represent a huge sea of domestic child sex trafficking, but that's based on the assumption of greater profitability, which we haven't found any more than anybody could find that chattel slavery in the South was necessarily particularly profitable, except under very, very unusual circumstances in a particular kind of plantation in, say, Virginia with a cash crop. So, and we haven't found that there. So, what does that lead to in terms of policy problems here? Well, the biggest problem is that all of the help and rescue institutions are built around a fundamentally alien notion to most of these really actually often quite desperate and vulnerable young men and women who they really do need help, and they can't seek it in a situation where they're over 18, and it's usually 18 to 24. Peer networks are being criminalized by the law. That actually tends to drive good people out of their social network and leaves the creeps, the people who are willing to face the possibility of severe trafficking charges. It leaves them thinking the social workers they're dealing with want to get them back into being children again when childhood really didn't work out for them. And the thing that I actually worry about the most in terms of trafficking, and I'm not absolutely convinced there's anything except perhaps a very small fetish network that already knows each other, but if there are these people out there described in the TVPA thing, I'm very concerned that the market, that these, you know, kidnapped, brutally trafficked young women and probably men too, that the market that they share with these more agential, more sort of autonomous 16, 17, and 18-year-olds, there's no bridge to those people who are the most desperately exploited, because these socio-legal institutions of TVPA have completely alienated the vast majority of the people that they're going to be meeting in their working life. And so there's no bridge between their support and resource situations that's basically all of us and maybe you people in the government, and the people who might need, the only bridge is going to be the people they share the market with. Finally, I guess I'd say that you know, it might be worth looking at some countries like, well, where I worked last, Australia, that seem to have a great deal less of these problems because, for instance, the minimum wage, which is usually for young people, is about $18 or $19 an hour. Subway job at $7.25 an hour, or what you see is occasional prostitution and leads to much more. Healthcare, by the way, there is free. I'm not trying to advertise for expatriating yourself to Australia, but I'm saying that there's some very, very real problems that some of the most desperate teenagers I've ever seen have. And the problem is not being rescued from some kind of pimp with a diamond cane. The problem is being rescued from a choice between supporting yourself and your two children at 17 through prostitution, or working at Subway for $7.25 an hour and basically being able to guarantee that your kids don't have the kind of nutrition or the kind of advantages that the children you're describing sound like they have. So that's I think I went way over. I'm sorry.
Great. No, that was excellent. Thank you. So, our last panelist that we'll hear from is Trupkaew, and she's a freelance writer and investigative journalist who's currently working on a book on human trafficking and labor exploitation. She has a pretty extensive investigative journalist background as an Open Society Fellow, Fulbright recipient. Her work has appeared in many outlets, including The Nation, The New York Times, and
Great, thank you so much. So when I speak, I often start with a little bit that never seems to grow old, because the need for it never dies, which is I feel the need to apologize as a journalist, because we often engage in trafficking of our own kinds, and we traffic in bad numbers and simplistic and salacious stories. And the problem with these bad numbers and these simplistic and salacious stories is that it fuels a kind of urgency and a call of state of emergency to create solutions that are actually not very effective and furthermore can actually harm the targeted victim population. So let's start with a number. Did you know that 100,000 to 300,000 young people are trafficked into the sex trade in the US every year? Well, you actually don't know that because that number is wrong. That number includes the category of young people who are considered at risk, and that category includes runaways, 77% of whom return home within a week, young transgender people, female gang members, and people who live near a border. So why does this particular large number matter, especially when even one child being trafficked is one too many? And it matters because it gives us a sense of a plague, of something that we need to fight with great urgency. And there is a number of stories that have emerged out of children enmeshed in the sex trade, beaten, burned, branded with a pimp's name or a barcode, locked into the trunk of a car, and forced to provide sexual services for countless callous and violent men. How many people have heard that particular story in some shape or form? Please raise your hands for me. Oh, very good. So that person, young woman, does indeed exist. However, she does not need to be used to further an ideological campaign to try and end all prostitution. She deserves the kind of government support and services that we too often do not provide for young people in this situation, and other young people involved in the sex trade that do not fit this criteria. Actually, they need these services and they don't get them. So what I was kind of interested in doing is I began noticing all these numbers and these different stories and how they were attached to a specific campaign that is called In Demand. And there's a specific catchphrase that this campaign uses called, they say no, what do they say exactly? They say no demand, no supply. And so what this is a campaign to increase criminal penalties against people who buy sex. And they believe this campaign is something that will upend the market that fuels prostitution and sex trafficking. So as a result of these kind of campaigns, there have been multiple law enforcement sweeps, targeted raids, John School, where people who have bought sex from undercover police officer are required to take a scared straight kind of course. All these different tactics, and it sounds, promising, but there is a problem with the kind of framework around the issue. And so they use this notion of this abused teenage girl who's raised in the blight of the inner city and forced into the sex trade by a man with a diamond cane. And but in doing so, they disregard the fact that a lot of individuals, boys, men, and transgender individuals, are involved and enter into the sex trade for a variety of reasons. So this sex industry, like any other sector pretty much, involves adults laboring in conditions that range from exploitative to upscale and forced to freely chosen. There's a whole continuum of experience that is being obviated by this incredibly powerful, incredibly urgent image. So this End Demand campaign is something that's become very popular in law enforcement and feminist circles when we talk about domestic minors in the sex trade. And so a lot of that work came out of anti-pornography work in the 80s, actually, and a coalition of conservatives and evangelical Christians who worked during George W. Bush's time to try and abolish prostitution altogether. So this was a kind of coalition, I guess I would argue, that often ignores the legal distinctions between prostitution and human trafficking. And so we've heard a lot about this already this morning, but I just want to say very simply again that federal law states that forced prostitution only happens when a commercial sex act is induced through force, fraud, or coercion, or when the person induced to perform it is under 18. And there's some confusion and some malleability here about the inducement piece, that there does need to be a pimp who is telling a young person to sell themselves for sex, for that young person to be considered a trafficking victim. So, but the main point I think I want to add here is that not all prostitution is trafficking, and not all trafficking, as those who are exploited and sometimes sexually abused in the fields and factories across our country would attest to, is prostitution. But we enter into a problem when we talk about sex trafficking and when we talk about human trafficking and the only thing that comes to mind is sex trafficking. So although this End Demand campaign emerged out of anti-prostitution rhetoric, it's actually a movement to try and change prostitution policy from a current legal framework in which both buying and selling sex are criminalized to what's called the Swedish model, in which selling sex is not illegal, but buying sex is a criminal offense. This sounds ostensibly good. It sounds like a reversal of unfair gender practices and socialization. But unfortunately, it has not panned out as promised in its home country of Sweden. Street prostitution there dropped, only to climb again. People in the sex trade have said that they are forced to rush negotiations with very wary clients, and they have to rely more on intermediaries to access those clients. So prostitution, especially on the street, hasn't really gone away, it's gone underground. So if you can imagine the Swedish model in the American context, it looks very different. Because as a Brooklyn DA told me, no politician wants to look like a hug-a-thug. So the idea of decriminalizing sex, you would get crucified for that. So what you wind up with here in the States is no social safety net. Like, we're not a social welfare state like Sweden, and we're not gonna do that probably. And so no social safety net for people who would actually like to leave prostitution. And what you actually wind up getting is a criminalization of all and services for very few. So what happens when young women or people in the sex trade are swept up in these raids and these sweeps is you have a criminal record. And what does a criminal record do? It excludes you from affordable housing and sustainable wage jobs. And it was argued by the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking in Colorado that did an extensive study of arrest data that this actually increases, even if they're victim-based arrests and law enforcement initiatives, if you have a criminal record, it increases your vulnerability to trafficking because you have no access to the kind of jobs and the kind of housing that would support a sustainable lifestyle for you and your family. So the problem with this kind of approach is it doesn't also take into account the abuse suffered by people in the sex trade by authorities. So I looked at one report, which was conducted by young women currently and or formerly in the sex trade in Illinois, and they found that police account for 30% of all reported abuse, compared with just 4% of abuse arising from pimps. So 30% of abuse cases were by police, and 4% were abused by pimps. So that's a really startling number. One of the young people said, I was going to meet a new John. It turned out to be a sting set up by the cops. He got violent with me, handcuffed me, and then raped me. He cleaned me up for the police station, and I got sentenced to 4 months in jail for prostitution. And then when I was in New York, a young woman who's trafficked into the sex trade as a minor told me sometimes, the police are the ones abusing you, taking your money and beating you up, and they offer no help, even if I get raped by a John. I've had to provide services more than once in exchange for not being arrested. Who is really gonna hold them accountable? So I'm not gonna go so far as to say that law enforcement should not be involved in what's a criminal justice framework around the human trafficking. That wouldn't be very pragmatic of me. But I would argue that law enforcement should actually do their job and investigate and prosecute traffickers and all of those who rape and assault those in the sex trade, including law enforcement. And what else do we need? We need public ombudsmen, we need tough internal affairs bureaus, and monitoring punishment of corruption and abuse. So if a young woman or a young person in the sex trade could actually report rape to the police rather than run away from them, then they might have a higher chance of being discovered as a trafficking victim, if indeed they are. So I also want to kind of stress non-law enforcement strategies. So a lot of the young people that I've met engage in survival sex, as it's called, without an intermediary, without a pimp, as Anthony was saying. So this is not to say if you don't fit the definition of a child sex trafficking victim that you should not receive services, as I think Ann Jordan pointed out so astutely this morning. Just because you don't fit a definition, you're barred from services. It doesn't make sense to me at all when we're considering the desperation and the need of the young people that I've certainly seen. So, you know, a lot of the young people I met also, their entrance into the sex trade occurred out of the foster care system or child welfare system. In New York City, 70% of the young people surveyed by our child welfare system had actually had previous contact with the child welfare system. They were in group homes, there was an investigation of an allegation of abuse, or they were placed in a foster home. So I met numerous young people who had actually been pimped out by their foster fathers, starting from age 10 to 14. And they wind up running away from home, or they get recruited out of a group house, and these are the same institutions that are tasked with helping young people leave the life. It just seems like something's not quite going right there. So, so I started with talking about numbers and stories. So I just want to end with 2 numbers and stories. So in New York City, there are 4,000 homeless youth who lack stable housing. They're on the streets every night, and there are barely more than 100 shelter beds, long-term shelter beds for them. So 4,000 young homeless people and maybe a little bit over 100 shelter beds for them. And in New York, you can get arrested for loitering, for being a public nuisance, for any number of things. It's kind of hard for you to be out in the streets when you're a young person in New York City. So what do young people wind up doing? They engage in survival sex to have something to eat and a place to stay so they won't get thrown in jail for being out. So, it's a long shot, and we can move to Australia, but I'd like to imagine what it would be like if people had access to educational opportunities and sustainable wage jobs and actually long-term shelter as young homeless people. And so I also wanted to end with a story. When I was trying to find young people to speak with, because, we journalists are tied to this notion of the anecdotal lead, which gets us in a lot of trouble because we find one person and we make them stand in for a whole social phenomenon. That doesn't ever quite work, because a person is much more than a social phenomenon. And also, I think it's important to remember that any trafficking victim is not a victim. People are always more than the worst things that's happened to them. And that's something that's too often forgotten, I feel. So I met a young woman when I was staking out the Queens County AIDS Center, because this NGO had a kind of open door policy for their spare office, and young people who were street involved would come and hang out and stay overnight or sleep, just rest, be inside. And sometimes on cold mornings, you couldn't even get the door open. There'd be so many young people just like stacked up like cordwood in this room, because there was nowhere else for them to be. And this was not an organization that offered services for young homeless people at all. It was an organization that was devoted to providing services for people who were were HIV positive or drug using HIV positive individuals. So young homeless people would just be hanging out there, and I would get to talk to them sometimes if they felt like it. And I met a young woman there named Donna, and she told me that for her, after I told her about all these end demand campaigns to arrest Johns and rescue young people out of sexual servitude, she told me that for her, like, ending prostitution, that wouldn't have been the answer for her. She was like, I needed some social services. I needed some help when I was involved in all this. So she said, you know, a responsive and sensitive law enforcement system, that would have been nice if I had actually been able to go to the cops and tell them that I was being hurt. She's like, long-term shelter, somewhere to sleep for more than just like 180 days would have been great. And then she said that she really wanted me to remember something. She said, people call you a survivor after you leave the life, but I was a survivor when I was in it. So I think that's something worth thinking about. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Great. So now we have a few minutes, I've been told 20 minutes, for discussion among the panelists. Yes?
So thank you for your fantastic talks. So I have this difficult question to ask because I think it's a question I've been asked. There's this very frequent argument, and Anthony sort of alluded to it, that if you're a minor, you really cannot consent. You cannot consent to paid sex, and so it's a very common belief that you can't think. You know, I mean, it's like you can't make a decision about sex, paid sex, before you're 18. And so there's an argument that's frequently used. It's an argument used by many to get money from the government. And it's kind of just like a common belief that the government abides by. And so, I mean, I guess this is from your experience, how would you argue against that? Because it's very difficult to have a conversation with people who actually just really believe that if you are below 18, you cannot consent to sex, period. You know, and it's a very powerful argument that I think most Americans agree with.